Well, welcome everybody to the Someone to Tell It To podcast. We're so glad to see you join us today. We're glad that you're here. And Tom and I really looked forward to this interview with Jamia Wilson. And I want to credit Tom for learning about her and finding her and inviting her. It was a tremendous interview and conversation that we had together, and I was really grateful for it.
Yeah, and Jamia is just one of these people that as I was spending some time researching, as Michael and I do for every interview, listening to other interviews that she's participated in, I just found her to be filled with an immense amount of wisdom for somebody, especially for somebody in her 30s. Oh my goodness. And I wanted to just learn more. So I kept listening to more and more and more of her interviews. And I'm just excited to continue to follow more of her work.
So am I. And the interviews that I listened to and articles I read, blogs, were just tremendous. And we feel very fortunate to have her as a guest. There's a quote that we found by Andy Stanley. It goes like this: if we fail to listen to people who don't experience the world the way we do, we will discount everything that doesn't fit perfectly into our own flawed worldview. And we agree with that very much. And we think it's incumbent upon us to learn about other people's worldviews, to learn about their lives, their experiences, their situations. And having Jamia on today is absolutely one way that we personally can do that together. But we hope that everyone who's listening can do that as well.
Most of us repel this notion of being uncomfortable, but in reality, uncomfortability is most often what fuels us, grows us, challenges us, and hopefully shapes us into the people that we long to be, the people we've ultimately been created to be. Without uncomfortability, we don't go anywhere, we don't learn anything new. And so this interview makes us uncomfortable in a good way. To give you a little bit of a bio of her, Jamia Wilson is a feminist activist, a writer, and a speaker. As director of the feminist press at the City University of New York and the former VP of programs at the Women's Media Center, Jamia has been a leading voice on women's rights issues for over a decade. Her work has appeared in numerous outlets, including the New York Times, The Today Show, CNN, Elle, BBC, Rookie, Refinery 29, Glamour, Teen Vogue, and The Washington Post. She is the author of Young, Gifted, and Black, The Introduction of an Oral History in Together We Rise, Behind the Scenes at the Protests Heard Around the World, Step Into Your Power, 23 Lessons on How to Live Your Best Life, Big Ideas for Young Thinkers, ABCs of AOC, and the co-author of Roadmap for Revolutionaries, Resistance, Advocacy, and Activism for All. Jamia is also a storyteller and has been termed a natural-born thought leader. So, we hope you loved this interview as much as we did. Well, Jamia, welcome to our podcast today. It is so good to have you on the program. We know you get asked to do so many interviews and have many conversations with many notable outlets and people, and the fact that you would give up an hour, especially on a Friday afternoon, of your time with us just means so much to us and to our listeners. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I love the premise of your program and what you all are doing. So I feel really honored to be a part of a conversation today and to meet you.
Well, one of the questions we've had is from the first moment that we heard you speak, and then afterwards, as we've listened to more and more of your talks and we've read more of your writing, we've been overwhelmed with your sense of kindness, your compassion, empathy, and love for humanity, and also your determination and your willingness to lean into discomfort, which is a phrase that we often use when talking about problematic things, and to address timely, relevant, crucial, and sensitive topics. And we just like you to talk a little bit about where that sense of compassion and love for people comes from, but also that sense of resolve.
Thank you. I really appreciate you saying this. I need to, and I feel like we all need this right now, to have this kind of affirmation from other humans right now. I talked to a couple of friends this week who have, been going through loss or triggers related to loss that this moment can enliven in any of us who are kind of living through this global pandemic and this collective period of loss, reckoning, facing the big existential questions of life and purpose. And I am someone who is generally said, oh, we need to lean into discomfort. Comfort zones are not places where I generally have grown or where I've witnessed a lot of growth in other people around me. And yet I find myself in the past few months and in this past year really wanting to cling to that which is stable, and then seeing many elements in my life pointing in the direction that, oh no, your growth actually needs for you right now to be willing to transform, to be willing to let parts of yourself die for new parts to regenerate, to be born. And facing my own sort of stubbornness around saying, oh, 2020 doesn't feel like a good time to actually do any stretching because I've stretched enough, right? And yet knowing that this is what we're called to do, and that it's also a blessing to be able to be in a place of growth, right? And to be able to be in a place of expansion, to be able to have that opportunity to take risks. And so I'm in it just like everyone else right now too, just feeling my own sense of stress and sense of panic and I think it's partially because, I'm here in this experience with everyone else. But then I also think that, just like the pandemic has laid bare for our governments and our structures and our businesses and our economy, that which needs to be healed and fixed, I think it does the same for us as people, that I am thinking, oh, there are things I kind of repressed or as a coping or survival mechanism pretended don't bother me that are happening in my life and my relationships and institutions, et cetera. And right now you can't hide from them. You kind of have a lot of time to sit with yourself, your thoughts and your realities. And so I'm trying to kind of address that, face it, forgive myself for any judgment I have around how I've either shown up to or failed to show up to those things. And then understand and know that whatever happens from my facing it will be growth, even if it hurts. But I think it's harder to do than we're often told, or that it seems. And I think I'm just living in that. I like that you said that I have this resolve, because I need to remind myself that after this call and my next meditation, because I've been finding myself really resistant to opportunities for growth, and even kind of seeing some self-sabotage show up and kind of wanting to say why. And I think it's because, we've all been asked to grow and stretch so much because of this moment, right? And so I'm just noticing, there's this part of me that really doesn't want to grow right now. It really wants to just hide and be safe. And that's not an option.
Yeah. We all love that sense of comfort. We're drawn to comfort, but comfort isn't always the best place for us to be, because like you said, that growth just doesn't occur when we're comfortable. So we need to be drawn to the things that make us uncomfortable, because we know in the long run, it's going to stretch us the way that we need to be stretched. So thanks.
We certainly understand that. And, we, again, as Tom said, we all love that comfort, and especially now because we have been stretched so far and so hard that it's understandable, but we also know that it is in the discomfort where we grow the most. And in fact, you mentioned loss, and this is a time of great loss for people, not simply the physical loss of people, but so many losses in our lives. So, the losses of just community and interaction and connection and health and jobs and so much. And in fact, we're writing a book. We've been writing for a couple of years, putting together a book about loss. And we are really trying hard this summer to do as much of it and get it finished as quickly as we can, because we think, well, if there's a time that perhaps a book like this is needed for people to deal with loss, to face it, to talk about it, to confront it, now's the time. And so we just think it's extremely vital right now. We have another question for you. If we remember correctly, you grew up as an expatriate in Saudi Arabia.
I did.
Is that right?
Yes, it's
So
true.
what are some of the experiences that shaped you and
Mm.
enriched you as you grew up? That, especially the experiences that have paved your way, to be the person who you are today and the issues that you care so deeply about. And we ask this because we've written about this too. The fact that when we think back on our lives as children, um, there were glimpses when we look back as to who we would be today. There were
Mm.
glimpses of how we are now spending our time and our energy, and especially in the fact that we believe that humans need to connect in deep, intimate, vulnerable ways. And so we just ask you what were those times and places and things, that people who
Mm.
influenced you to become who you are today.
Yeah, I think about Saudi Arabia a lot. I miss it a lot. I consider it one of my homes. Although I think when one grows up with an expatriate identity, you spend a lot of time having your identity be one of displacement or one of not being at home. But I think that I learned that home has a different meaning to me than it might for people who kind of were born in their same hometown and stayed there and formed their life there and their relationships and grew up there. And so even seeing the difference between myself and my parents, when my parents wanted to move back to the States, they really wanted to move back to their hometowns. And I really resisted. I really didn't want to do that. And it's been interesting talking to my father about it now that my mom's passed away. And I talked with her about it when she was still here, about how I was the one who was adamant that we should not return to their hometowns, because I never felt like those places were home to me. And I think that that is something that is really interesting, that I always felt outsider even among like my own family, because I had a different dialect, a different experience, a different way of seeing the world. And not that I didn't love many aspects about home, or not that I didn't connect culturally to certain things, but that I just knew I was different, by virtue of growing up under different conditions, by virtue of growing up expat, which is in itself an identity, of being in and in between. That is hard for people to understand who haven't lived it, or who have a different kind of rootedness to a place or to a culture or to a set of conditions. And so I think about that a lot. And I think that's why I've been drawn to cities like New York City and Washington, D.C., and when I lived in Berkeley and Oakland, because those are places where you see a lot of people who are living in transition, or moving from all over the world, or there's a lot of diversity in those places. And so when I look at my life now and how I've chosen to build it and with whom I've chosen to build it, the places I've gone, it makes a lot of sense to me, because I'm more comfortable in spaces where there are people who've been a lot of places, lived a lot of places, are used to people who might be different, or didn't grow up there, and who are welcoming to people who didn't grow up there and set their lives up there. So that's just an observation that I've been leaning into. And I think Saudi Arabia, there's so many things that I remember. I remember the first time I set foot there when I was 5.5 years old, and just what it smelled like, and what the heat felt like, and what it was like to, have the feeling of dust on your skin getting off the plane, the smell of like incense and oils, and eating new foods and spices that I'd never experienced. And then those things becoming my familiar, and becoming the things I crave now, or the things that feel like home to me, just as much as something like biscuits and cornbread also feel like home to me, because I was raised in a Southern Black family. So I have a lot of connection to that, but I think it's more about the people. So when I think about a yearning or a connection, it's about the people I grew up with. And what I'm finding is that, as it relates to the people, we are all kind of discovering that it wasn't so much the place. Like, there was so much about the beauty of Saudi Arabia and the hospitality of the people, and the ability to travel the world, and those things that we were afforded in that access time in our lives. But it was really about the people who were in Saudi Arabia at that particular time in Saudi Arabia's history, and that particular time in expat experience in Saudi Arabia. That just connecting with expats who grew up there in the 60s, they had a different experience than what we did for the people who were growing up there when I was there in the 80s and 90s. And I'm having a different experience than the expats who are growing up there now. And so what I've discussed with a lot of my classmates, who are the people that I miss, and the experience I think of when I have that yearning is about those people, these other fellow expats, and also Saudis I went to school with who were a part of that experience, that it was about that time and place. It was about the people who were there, what was happening in the world at that time, our shared experiences around that, and the changes that were happening. And I think I'm really curious about, what is it like for the people who are growing up there now that women have the right to drive, now that guardianship laws are being talked about in a way that they weren't when I was younger, to that degree, or now that there's more voting rights for women in Saudi Arabia, although more needs to happen. And so all of that has really shaped my perspective. But I also think that growing up there, and then sort of prejudices and stereotypes I experienced from Americans who found that out about me when I came back here, also shaped my perspective about how I look at my home country and how I look at my relationship to it. That I think I have an openness to critiquing America in a way that I don't know that I would have with the same sort of lack of self-consciousness, I think, if I didn't grow up here. And it's, I think the James Baldwin quote really resonates with me, that he loves America, but also part of that love is about loving the right to critique it. Like, that's the part of free expression and those liberties, et cetera. And I think for me, coming here and just having people say things like, I'll give you an example. I had a doctor once who was asking me about did I ever live or grow up in a developing country, et cetera. And I, wrote down everywhere I'd lived or been exposed. And it was about figuring out why I had a gastrointestinal illness. And when he heard where I grew up, he said, well, why would your parents raise a girl child there? And I remember being so offended by that, because I wanted to say, well, you could just ask, why would my parents raise a Black child here? And he got really offended when I asked that. But I didn't mean to be adversarial, right? Like, it was more like I really wanted to reflect back to him what that sounded like, that I'm like, oh yes, like, I'm not going to debate with you that there need to be better human rights laws there, and we need to interrogate these laws around gender. But last time I checked, women don't have constitutional equality in the US. We are not written to the Constitution. We don't have an Equal Rights Amendment. Even if Hillary Clinton had become president, she would not have been protected equally by the Constitution. So it was interesting to me to see that he took that so personally and was so angry, and took that like as if I was saying something that was almost like blasphemous or heretical. And in fact, I was just saying that, I believe more in complexity and nuance because of how I grew up. Because yes, Saudi Arabia inarguably has many laws that I would like to see changed around human rights, around gender justice, around racial justice, many things. And so does the United States. And also, Saudi Arabia had street harassment laws that we don't have here as it relates to gender, right? And so I think that that's just something I gained from that experience, that I very much reject this attitude that there's any country that's better than any other country from like a competition top-down sort of thing. I just don't see the world in that way. And I'm more interested in how we can talk about these complexities and nuances without saying, oh, well, we have these things to fix here, but we're better than there. That is not the kind of dialogue I like to be caught up in. And I think it's problematic. So yeah, I think that if anything, that's the great gift I got from growing up there, is just seeing the world as in its entirety, like kind of beyond borders, and about humans and about change and about connection and transformation, away from kind of trying to protect any ideals that are better than others, or somehow worse than others. More about like, how do we create conditions for everyone in the world to thrive, heal, get support, get resources, be interdependent and collaborative. And I think I've had to do a lot of work to realize that might not be how other people have been conditioned, just because I find myself in my comfort zone most actually with a lot of the people I grew up with when talking about politics and things like that, because I will still have those moments when, even in sort of dialogues around gender justice, which I've focused on, sometimes people be surprised that they'll say, oh, your perspective much more aligns with that of, say, African feminists or feminists of the global South than a specific US perspective on XYZ thing. And that makes a lot of sense to me, but it might not to people who don't know my story. Just by looking at me, they'll say, oh, we expected this lens, and it sometimes can cause friction for me.
It's so helpful for our listeners to get to know more about you. And before we get into some of those things where you do some critiquing, which we think is helpful and necessary, especially for those of us who are of the white race and especially for males, we think this is going to be really helpful for us. But before we even get off of that, we'd like to just talk a little bit more about, I know in some of the interviews, I've appreciated your sense of openness in talking about some of the stage fright that you get before speaking and some of your anxiety. I too struggle with this and have had to learn to accept and even embrace it for what it is. I do a lot of speaking now, as does Michael, and it's part of who I am. And I know in one of your interviews, you said that it taught you to be courageous and to do things anyway. And your goal and mission is so much more important than the fear. And so I know for me, I wanted to ask you this, and what are some of the ways that you remain steadfast in your mission? What's been most helpful to you? What carries you through when there are roadblocks or naysayers or voices in your head that tell you that you can't do something?
One, I just want to honor in you that you know that you have that you're facing that same sort of experience in your life, right? And I think that it's so great you're speaking about it, because I don't think we have a society where, especially with men, right, that they're able to talk about what it feels like to feel vulnerable and what it means. And I think there's a lot of tropes around how Black women should show up in the world, right? And I struggle with some of those stereotypes and how I'm expected to be, right? And also kind of just saying, hey, I'm just a human being trying to make my way in the world, and I show up this way, and this is who I am, and I can't be contorted into a box and that kind of thing. And so I think for me, I kind of have to just live with it. I have to say, wow, I was born this way. This is who I am, or this sort of beliefs, values, and assumptions I was raised in, and the conditioning that I've experienced have led me to have this set of fears, this set of anxieties, this set of sensitivities, this set of strengths, and all of those things make me me. But I shouldn't attach myself to feelings of shame about them, even if others feel like those are things I should be shameful about. And actually, it's quite revolutionary to have a practice of honoring and embracing those things, and forgiving those things in myself, even if I've been taught to kind of sweep them under the rug or pretend they're not there. And I think for me, it's about disrupting those things and really kind of being willing to write off or edit out that critique if it comes from, as I've now started naming them, people who aren't credible sources. And that is not, and I don't say that to say it's minimizing that, any person's less than because I say a credible source. It's just that they're not a credible source on my life. They're not a credible source on my worth. They're not a credible source on defining my meaning and purpose, because they haven't walked in these shoes. And that's something I just remind myself when, if I see a nasty comment online or someone says something that feels belittling or minimizing to me, I really have to say, oh, wow, is that really a credible source? And really kind of bring myself back to center. And when I think back to, who would I then consider credible sources, and whose advice and who gets to be in the inner circle of those whose credible sorcery I take seriously when they give me feedback, it actually helps me to be quite clear on what is important and what is nourishing and what is foundational to my growth, and then what is also just noise. And I try to do that quite tactically. I have, and I talked about this on Guy Kawasaki's podcast, and he really got a kick out of it. But my parents were really into Colin Powell's rules for leadership, to the point where they had these little laminated printouts of them that they had made and would hand them out to my dates. My husband has his original copy. That was, thrilling / embarrassing. But then also,
we weren't going to bring this up, but we listened to that interview and we think this is awesome. So thank you for sharing it.
Oh my gosh. I mean, when I finally met Colin Powell, I thought, I think God wants me to tell him that, in addition to the 10 commandments, I was raised with Colin Powell's rules. And I had to go tell him, and he's like, are you following these rules? And, a big one I go to a lot is number 12, don't take counsel of your fears or naysayers. Another one, for people with anxiety, don't let adverse facts stand in the way of a good decision. That's another one that I think about a lot. he also has this one: avoid having your ego so close to your position that when your position falls, your ego goes with it. I just learning that before I even got into the workforce was like fundamental. I didn't even understand what my parents were talking about when they would like say, like, learn these rules, understand them. And now that I've, been in CEO roles and et cetera, and knowing that, I'm like, these really are like, these rules are foundational, and they kind of transcend political ideology. And they're just really good rules for how to be a human who's striving to do great things. He says, have a vision and be demanding. I feel that very much encompasses how I show up in my life. And I love that he says, be demanding, right? I think as a woman being demanding, as a Black woman who considers myself being demanding, there are people who would describe that demandingness with other words that I won't use on this podcast, and who have described that with other words. And I'm like, no, I'm demanding. I have a real clear vision for what I think is excellent and what I think is mediocre. And I'm not afraid to say it, or what I think is subpar, right? But that, because I come in this body that's like, less than 5'6" tall and looks the way that it does, sometimes people are quite bothered by that demandingness. And now I kind of understand, no, that's just leadership. And so I really think that, just knowing that other people have been on the path before, looking at roadmaps from my life apprentices, I often talk about that, people like Colin Powell, who, although I'm politically very different than he is, I've learned a lot from through his writing and through his way of thinking, and also just really, really learning how to trust in my own inner guidance and voice as a spiritual person. Just learning how to turn down the volume on other people's noise. And that's something I really struggle with, because I identify as an empathetic person and I'm highly sensitive to other people's energy, other people's pain, all of that, and deeply intuitive. And I've had to do a lot of my work around how to set healthier boundaries to say, hey, I can show up for you and hold space for you without taking on your noise. And I think with those of us who have anxiety around public speaking and things like that, it's really about learning that when I have my anxiety about speaking publicly, a lot of times it's because I'm taken in the energy of the room, and I'm taken in the energy of someone in the room who had whatever look on their face or whatever distraction they were having with their phone or whatever. And then I create a narrative in my head about how my message will be received or how I'll be judged. And it'll trigger back some past moment of feeling belittled or diminished. And then I have to kind of be like, or I could really tune into that place within me that is most powerful, that is closest to God, that is closest to spirit, that is closest to truth, and like turn the volume up on that and turn the volume low on the other thing, and then just show up. And I actually do a prayer before I do any of my speaking or any kind of, big thing like that, where I will often just say, if I can't find the words, like, God, please speak through me. And then whenever I do that, it works. And then if I find myself in an anxiety response, which I have as someone who lives with anxiety too, just like clinically, I'll say, oh, my ankles are shaking. I'm observing that. And I'll be like, please, God, send strength to my ankles. Send strength to my stomach that hurts right now. Send a knowledge to my heart that you will never leave me alone. And somehow I get there, or even just as simple as this simple prayer, which is, please, put an angel or ancestor of protection above me, below me, on either side of me to carry me through this. And it always works. Mm-hmm. It always works.
And I've also found too, and this actually ties into our work as someone to tell to, is just having people who are always going to stand in your corner, that you could get up, whether it's on stage or it's writing something that's more public or whatever it might be, dealing with something that's more controversial, that you always have people that are going to be in your corner no matter what. And you could literally jump off a cliff and they're going to jump with you, or they're going to be there to catch you when you fall. That is just, it's invaluable. I mean, that's how our mission actually began, with my relationship with Michael doing exactly that for me. And it's just evolved. And now we connect with a lot of people around the world who they're in that place where they feel isolated and alone in that space of anxiety or whatever it might be. And they just need for lack of a better phrase, someone to tell it to, someone to be
Mm.
with them in those moments. So yeah, thanks a lot for just talking about that. I know it's helpful for me, and I'm sure, I have no doubt it's going to be helpful for our listeners as well, as people, just are learning to be more confident in who we would say God's created us to be. So
Yes, yes. And I love that, someone to tell it to. I think I read an article just a couple days ago that really got me in my gut, and something you just see yourself in it, right? You see something you haven't been able to voice. And it was about reciprocal nurturing. And it was a Black woman writing about how she felt that Black women in a lot of organizations became nurturers and were nurturers to other people in their community, but weren't getting that mercy and empathy back. And that's been an ongoing trend I've seen in my life that has caused me a lot of hurt, and I haven't talked about a lot beyond my closest people. But to have someone write about it really felt freeing to me. And it was like someone to tell it to, right? That I'm like, this sister is talking about something that I have cried about so much, or that I've talked about in therapy, to say, like, I'm just like wanting a shred of the mercy I give others, a shred of the empathy I give others. And wouldn't it be even better if I got all I give from others too, even more? And why does it feel so hard to get that shred, right? And I think it was about, having someone to tell it to be able to say, oh, even though I don't know this person who wrote the piece, her writing it somehow freed it to have me think, like, oh, this is a person I could talk to about this, that there's someone out there walking this path. And not that you would want someone to be experiencing the same kind of struggle you have in the world, but to know, like, someone else was able to air this out. And so it means that you're not walking alone in your experience. So I think what you're doing is really important, because I think so much of the pain that we experience in the world is about and around feeling alone. And so much of the harm that is done is around making people feel like they are isolated and alienated and alone. And I think it's imperative, it saves lives for people to have someone to talk to. I lost someone whose work I'd been following and supporting for years. Just a couple days ago, Daisy Coleman, who was a survivor of rape when she was in high school, and started her own nonprofit and co-founded it with other survivors, ended up passing away and dying suicide this week. And many of us are mourning her. And I know that there were many other times when she felt that she had been alone, and people who she was able to connect with helped bring her back. And this time, unfortunately, it didn't happen. But I've been thinking a lot about that what does it mean that, this terrible thing that happened to her, this terrible brutality that she experienced, made this 23-year-old woman feel so alone, so distraught, and so in pain, that she would end her own life. And so I've just been thinking a lot about, what is it that we can do, those of us who care, to change our culture so that no one would ever feel that kind of pain, that they couldn't live anymore, that they could not have peace.
I remember I saw that. I saw the news about her death, and I'm really sorry that you've lost someone,
Thank you.
and that she had to experience what she experienced, and just it is very sad. And why do you think that you or any of us who we hope are empathetic, sensitive, gracious, kind, don't often or always receive the same thing back in return? Can you dissect that at all? Do you have some theories, or some understanding as to what that's about? Because I think that Tom and I could probably say that we both felt that as well. Because we the work that we're about is about empathy and kindness and listening. And well, we encounter a world of people who aren't very good listeners, and we see a lot of a lack of empathy around us and in the headlines. And what do you think that's about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a thing I grapple with a lot, and it takes a lot of my sort of bandwidth that I still am working through, right? Around kind of, I think that like my deepest inner child is still trying to figure that out, right? It's like one of the big existential questions for me. And, you know, it's almost like I get letters from kids a lot around my children's books, and they'll be like, racism is so dumb. I don't understand why adults do this, right? And it's fundamental, and I'm fundamentally agree with that, right? That they're just like, this makes no sense, it's dumb, and why, right? I think, and it comes to me in the same sort of way of like my inner child just being like, wow, what, like why is it that there are people who choose to be cruel to others, to dominate others, to withhold compassion when they could choose love, when they could choose kindness, when they could choose beauty and joy versus struggle, right? Like to me, it just makes no sense in the most fundamental, most pure, earnest way, right? And yet we see and experience the opposite of that. And then you find the people who, and I've had this experience a lot, very much resent you for being kind, for being loving, for being empathetic, for various reasons. You know, one reason might be that they actually don't believe, because of their hurt, their trauma, that it's actually possible. So they think you must be fraudulent, if that is who you are, that it just actually can't be true. Or they believe that somehow your kindness, your goodness, your empathy makes them look bad. And so they need to diminish it and somehow prove your fraudulence by trying to get you to reflect back their bad actions. And so for me, it's something I very much identify with and think about. I have found myself to be a really sort of fierce friend to others who I see this happening to. You know, I see my husband as a person like us in that way, a very empathic, loving, soulful, beautiful person. And I rage when I see other people not holding that with the grace that it deserves. And yet he rages when he sees that in me. And we are both kind of like, why can't you do that same kind of raging on your own behalf? Or see what you see when other people are extending it to me and you're ready to go into as a gladiator. Why don't you do that for yourself, right? And so I also wonder, you know, what is the psychological toll on a spirit when you keep facing this pattern again and again and again? And for me, that has been the work, right? That is the work I'm currently doing right now. And I think some of it is you get messages, you know, so there's all these like different TED Talks and things about resilience and grit and all of that. And I'm really careful about that, because I think in some ways it is teaching young people that, oh, you know, to be empathetic means that you're somehow weak, or to be compassionate means that you're somehow weak, or to be kind means that you're somehow not strong. When in fact, I want to talk more about like, oh, what does it mean to be a healer? What does it mean to be a transformer? What does it mean to be fiercely graceful? And what does it mean to be a catalyst of change? Someone who's able to stand up in truth and know that, you know, that might leave you isolated, but that there's a beauty in that. And I'm really trying to do that work of embracing that myself, but also reflecting it back for young people, because I want the next generation to learn it less painfully than I have been. And then also earlier on to say, you know, for some of the things that actually make you the most beautiful, the things that make you the most caring and loving, and in some spaces might make you feel the most alone, are actually your superpowers. They're actually the things that help others, and other people might not reflect those things back to you. They may also be afraid to stand with you for all the reasons that you're afraid, right? And that part of our task is to learn to do those things anyway, and hope that in doing that, it'll inspire others to be courageous, and that you'll find those people, just like you two found each other, right? Like, I feel like, oh, it took me a lot of like painful relationships with people who didn't necessarily reflect back my giving and reciprocitous nurturing, as we talked about. It took a lot of that for me to finally find it in my life partner, and me thinking about, oh, what is it that I had to disrupt in myself to actually realize, oh, your job and role isn't just to be taken from, or to be used, or to be a vessel of giving. You also have a role in receiving, and that is also a part of your power, and a part of what is valuable and good for you too. And I think that's the thing we all have to grapple with. That's those of us who are healers in this life, as I like to see it, become quite accustomed and comfortable with being in that role of overgiving. And it can be really hard to accept from others. And I think that's what I struggle with a lot. And so I still don't have the answer to that question, because it's something that, sometimes I'll just wake up and weep about it and just be like, how do people treat people this way? Or how could someone speak to me in such a way? I would never speak to someone in that way. And my work is to really truly understand with every fiber of my being, and I haven't gotten there yet, that it has nothing to do with me, that those projections are not toxicity that I need to absorb. It doesn't mean anything about me. And yet I've had to ask myself why it is that I came to believe that those things have to do with me, and that, comes from culture or trauma, or systemic inequities, and all of those things are part of the reason why I do the work I do, right? To kind of reverse those dynamics. If those conditions were different, we wouldn't have these sort of attitudes normalized, these sort of behaviors normalized.
So is your husband in your tiny apartment with you right now hearing these things? We hope so.
He was here just a few minutes ago, but he just went outside. He usually takes his daily walk around this time now during the pandemic. But he was here. And, and I think it's so funny, because I feel like, having someone like him in my life is really, really special, because he's taught me so much about love, that he's just such a kind and generous and forgiving person. And I thought I was all those things, but I believe he is more of those things than I am. And that has been really interesting for me, that I learn a great deal about him. I mean, I started a fight we had yesterday, and he apologized to me when I woke up this morning. And I was kind of like, the fight we're going to have right now is that actually that was my fight to take accountability for. But I love you for finding your role and kind of, meeting me there, right? And taking responsibility for that. But really that was on me. And I think that it's just also taught me to be a better friend for my friends who I see kind of caught up in the cycles I used to be in, to say, hold out for your true match. You can find a match for your heart. You don't have to try to be there to fix anybody else's heart. That's not what you have to do. You don't have to be what you wish other people would become. There's a person out there for you, or people out there for you, who are just as loving, or more so, just as thoughtful, just as caring and empathetic.
Well, you might have to share this episode with him, because I'm sure those words would be like gold to him. Because I know when our wives do that for us, it means the world to us, honestly.
Oh, that's so lovely.
Yeah, we'd love to transition a little bit, though, to talk about some of the things that you're involved in right now. And I'm going to transition by sharing a quote from Rosa Parks. She said that memories of our lives, of our works, and our deeds will continue in others. And the reason I wanted to share that quote as a transition is there was an article in the New York Times recently about the passing of John Lewis.
Oof, yes.
Somebody that we all love and respect, and many of the things that you just described about your husband is probably well represented in who John Lewis was. And in this article was entitled "Why John Lewis Kept Telling the Story of Civil Rights Even Though It Hurt." And for those who are listening, in the article, the author writes that John Lewis served in Congress since 1987, representing Georgia in the House of Representatives, but his constituents were far from all the longtime legislator who died on Friday at age 80 represented. Lewis was a witness to, participant in, and survivor of some of the most pivotal moments of the American Civil Rights Movement. He gave a speech at the 1963 March on Washington. He marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama in 1965. He took part in more recent acts of resistance. In a movement in which so many great lights were extinguished early, his longevity left him to serve as a de facto spokesperson for what he saw. And it just goes on to talk about how he kept retelling his story. And you've talked about the importance of telling the story of the civil rights movement over and over and over again, and how it affects the people who hear it. But how does telling that story again and again affect you?
Yeah, I think about that a lot, in relationship to my late mother, and how she would often tell me these stories when I was younger, but then tell them to me as I got older and I was able to understand different layers of things, like tell me the story again with added layers. And I've learned about the importance of that because, one, it keeps the memories alive of those who did the work, and it keeps this next generation understanding the idea that we have to continue with the fight, that, you've got to stay vigilant. You can't just kind of let go and hope that the gains will just continue, that you have to continue to do the work. But I also think it was also about honoring the people who've done the work before you, so that you are also mindful of the fact that you're doing work now for people you may never meet, but whose lives you honor and whose lives you believe should be afforded with dignity and liberty and equality. And I think that's a big part of the telling the story. I also think, I think a lot about the African-American narrative tradition and storytelling being so important historically for us to pass things down, especially when reading and writing was forbidden in terms of slavery in this country, and what it meant to pass down stories through ancestors to make sure that familial history and lineage was not lost. And I think that is also seen in call and response, in freedom songs and in church songs and in the repetition. I mean, I wrote a paper in grad school about how Barack Obama, if you really look at his early speeches in the beginning, in his first campaign run, you hear the oration pattern of what happens in the Black church. You see the repetition, you see the songs in the oration, and it's really beautiful. And that, to me, harkened back to that narrative tradition of just like knowing who your people are, knowing where they came from, knowing where you're going, and connection to those stories. And so I saw a lot of that in John Lewis, and in that tradition, and also being Black and from the South originally, just feeling like he, reminded me of my uncles and my aunties and my parents and my grandparents, and the way they would tell me the stories. I also just think back to how I remember getting shouted down at an event once by some young people who differed with me on an approach for something. And I can't even remember what it was, but also having this moment of thinking like, oh, I'm getting challenged now. This is really interesting that like, I'm now at this point where I'm getting challenged by people I agree with on 99.9% things, but there's something different. And what does it mean to have that in our movements? And I remember being really upset about the critique, because I was thinking, oh, they're just not understanding where I'm coming from, et cetera, et cetera. And my mom just thinking, but oh, remember when you were really young and when you kind of first got into some of this and you were thinking only in terms of certain binaries and not necessarily the complicated nuances of some of these things, like have some compassion for where it's coming from. But at the end of the day, think about the heroes you've had who maybe you might have disagreed with how they saw some of the binaries, but because now you know all their complexities, you would hold them in esteem because of the summation of the works they did in their life. And she said, like, think about someone like John Lewis. You're going to measure the man in terms of a life of work. And so I think that a lot about him telling the stories, right? That was a story told to me about him, right? That like, oh yeah, you're going to have these leaders you're following, and they're going to do and say and think a lot of things and evolve and grow. And you could judge them on each thing and whether or not you agree with each thing or align 100% with each thing. But it's really important to kind of think of a legacy of work and the core values and the trajectory and what that meant. And so for me, because she said that to me, and because she said kind of like, be a John Lewis, in the sense of that was a story I got, like, be someone who, when they're talking about you at your obituary, that the conversation is about a trajectory of work, no matter what you're doing, whether or not you were like working on a farm or you were leading a protest or you were a representative, what would be the core values that they would say about the totality of your life? That is something that stuck with me and him and the storytelling around that movement, that the movement changed its face and form in many different ways, but the values and how he showed up for it were always there. And the way that he talked about it and the way he talked about his family and his beliefs about humanity, his beliefs about abundance and resources for everyone. And joy, when I think of John Lewis's life, I think of that beautiful video of him dancing to Happy and You know, that's what I think about. You know, the sacrifices he's made and Bloody Sunday, I mean, that will never also leave my mind. But what I think about is, wow, this is a man who has seen so much, given so much, like would understandably have had complete right to just say, I've done enough. Like, you all do the rest of the work. Until his dying day, had hope for us, had grace, had love, had gratitude, you know, just his love for Barack Obama, like all of that was just so beautiful. I think just the storytelling for me, for him, wasn't even just the stories he told. It was like the story of his life. The story of his life is just such an example for us. If each of us could have those values in whatever we do, we would all do better for the world.
Part of the reason we wanted to ask that question is because people have asked us, do you ever get tired of hearing someone's story? Like, especially if they have told it over and over and over again. And our response, in all honesty and in all seriousness, has always been, if people would have truly listened the first time or the second time, maybe they wouldn't have had to keep repeating it.
Yes. Oh my gosh, yes. And I think about, you know, and it's also because you all are doing such important work about learning about deep listening, right? When you hear a story over and over and over again, you actually hear something different every time. You know, part of it I think is, and I've just been writing about this recently, so it's in my mind, this idea of the Moravian principle, and, you know, this, like, that your nonverbal tells you a lot more than the actual words about what someone's saying or thinking. And sometimes when I've heard a story over and over, I'll say, what am I hearing and seeing in them? What am I seeing in their energy, their body, their facial expressions? What is that telling me? But then also as an editor, you know, as an editor of books, I learn a lot by seeing how different people tell the same story to different audiences or in different ways in their writing. And it tells me a lot about the author. And there will be some times where I'll say, oh, I noticed when you write for an academic audience, you are like this, but when you're writing for this other audience, you're like this, and this sounds more like who you are when I talk to you, who you are in real time. And can we talk about, like, how to get that in alignment, like who you are and the voice you're comfortable with writing on the page, right? And so, like, that idea of finding one's voice, as they say, or identifying your voice. So I think there's a lot of value in hearing the same story over and over. And then, like you said too, just that humans don't tend to listen really well. So it usually takes at least 3 times for the message to get heard, like, half-heartedly. And we need to hear repetition, which is why, you know, the pundits do it so well on TV shows, where you'll hear them say the same talking point 3 different ways over and over and over to solidify a message.
You mentioned voice, and, you know, one of our core principles is that we believe everyone has a voice that deserves and needs to be heard. Doesn't mean we agree with the voice. It doesn't mean that, you know, that all of it resonates with us, but we each have a voice, and we each need to tell our story. And so often we find that people are not allowed to tell their stories, that their stories are, you know, seen as insignificant, or they're not the right story that's supposed to be told. And I think we've probably all experienced that, where we've had our voices sometimes diminished because of, you know, public opinion, or because of, you know, others don't agree with it, or don't like it, or don't want it to be told, whatever the stories are to be told. And, you know, part of our goal is to allow people to tell their stories, because it is in the telling that truths can come out, that healing can begin, that hope can be found, we believe, and we can all learn that we're not alone, and you know, in our own stories. So we just applaud, you know, that you know, that those who believe that too, that stories need to be told.
I love that.
Over and over again until they're actually heard. Until they're actually heard.
And when people aren't here to tell their stories, you know, I think that's the thing of, like, you know, having lost people I love, you know, there's just so many things that you find out, you find out things about your loved ones when they've left, and you thought, oh, I talked to them about a great many things. And then you find out something else and you think, oh, I wish I could really ask them about that. I was reading an article that popped up because I keep a Google, sort of a Google alert on my late mom, and something came up recently. And I thought, well, she's no longer with us, so how did this come up? And it was a poem that my mom had written in a geometry class that ended up in a book that had won some national award in the 60s. And I'd never heard about it, and found myself sending it to my dad and other people. And then my dad was able to track down one of my mom's friends who said, oh yeah, I remember Frida writing that poem and getting recognition in school and all of that. But me really thinking, oh, I wish I'd heard that story. I wish I had known about it. And she talked so much about that time in her life, right? But that was just one of the stories I never heard. So it made me think about too, even the people who have done a good job of sharing their stories with us still hold so many stories that when they pass away, they take with them. So now I really have more of a mindfulness about really wanting to sit down with folks, and especially people I know who, may be transitioning or sooner. We know that might happen, to really make sure that we get those stories now, because there's so much I want to ask of people who've departed. And, and sometimes the stories want to come out at inconvenient times. I was thinking about my late grandmother, and she made one of my friends cry at my wedding. We were getting our makeup done in the morning before my wedding, and there were a lot of people there. I had 15 bridesmaids, which is a whole other conversation. That people are always like, what? And we had a lot of people to get their makeup done before this. And my grandmother was still kind of dealing a little bit with dementia at that time, but one of my friends had figured out that my grandmother had, been at Tuskegee at the time and had taught some Tuskegee airmen how to swim when she was on a sports scholarship there, and asked her that. But in the course of the story, my grandmother went from telling her that story to sort of having a flashback, and then thinking that this was a white person saying something negative to her, and yelled at this person because she thought she'd said a slur, but that's not what she said. And my friend cried, and it was a really kind of painful experience. And I remember just saying, oh, I'm so sorry. And like, for this happening for the wedding, this is such an awkward experience. And my friend just like in the midst of the tears saying, no, I kind of really understand it. And I kind of think that despite this kind of ugly thing that happened, that obviously she had so much pain associated with just like race at that time and how white people addressed her then, that brought her to that place, that wouldn't just by seeing me, but just like getting the story of her life and being able to hear about that time in her life was still really valuable, even though it became this like really combative, painful episode for everyone. And it's something I'll never forget, because I thought, oh yeah, that was not convenient. I wouldn't have, if I were designing the day of one's wedding, right, have wanted that to be what happened at all. But now I learned stories that I never knew. And I learned about trauma she had that I had not ever had a chance to talk about, that just got triggered that morning. Right. And it wasn't convenient, but it was real and it was true. And both of us will never forget it now.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about that in relation to John Lewis. And I'm thinking about this idea of storytelling. And I know we've quoted Martin Luther King in our second book when he had said that true compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. And I'm curious, where do you see the parallel between listening to stories and the fact that people keep telling them, perhaps because the restructuring is not occurring? And I'm seeing a parallel there. And also I'd like for you just to talk a little bit about what do you see needs restructuring right now? The primary issues that need restructuring.
Yes, I think, it's so interesting. I think that's the thing too. There's so many really important words from Martin Luther King that do not get amplified or reiterated or told in the way that they should. And I've been really excited about how Bernice King, particularly his daughter, has been really vocal about how she wants her father's true positions and framed with his perspective and not sort of a characterization of his perspectives. or an interpretation that serves other people's agendas, but like his actual perspectives and how that storytelling is so important, because he had a really clear vision about what should be reformed. And that was poverty, inequity, systemic inequality, and her call to not sanitize that, to say, oh, he was actually quite clear. Like, let's remember when he was murdered, so tragically, he was marching on behalf of workers, sanitation workers, right? And he was vehemently anti-war, and all of those were values around moving away from a place of dehumanization and violence and corruption, and moving toward a place of love and collaboration, resources distributed more equally and fairly to the whole, rather than just a small few. And all of those things are extremely important. So for me, I think one, part of why I work in the spaces of publishing and media is because I feel that one of the places we really need to reform is culture. And the way that we reform culture is by changing who gets to shape it and who has ownership of it. And we have to understand the economics of who has ownership of publishing and media, but then also have to change the story of how that shapes who gets voice and who gets platform and who gets to decide who else's voices are included and amplified and lifted up. And that's been one intervention and reformation that I think is extremely important, and a place where we need justice. And I think economic justice is extremely important because it impacts everything. You know, that it impacts gender, it impacts race, it impacts healthcare disparities we have in this country, it impacts everything, it impacts international policy. And so those are really important to me. And then I also think social emotional learning in our education system are extremely important. You know, everyone talks about STEM, and I think it's extremely important to talk about STEM and making sure that STEM is equal. But I also think, wow, if we really kind of put the kind of resources and amplification of what it means to fund equality in STEM into funding social emotional education that taught empathy in schools, which in other countries, that it is integrated into its public curriculum, that we would have some real impact on a variety of different indicators that we need change in our culture, related to social justice, related to community engagement, related to healthcare, related to environmental practices and human behavior, et cetera. So there's just so much that needs healing. And I think that what I think is an opportunity right now, because I don't want to say that I think COVID-19 is a good thing, because I do not, but I think that what is presented as a result of the oracle that is COVID is this opportunity to say, oh, okay, COVID's just dismantled a whole lot. So now that we rebuild, maybe we don't want to rebuild a structure that's faulty or kind of ridden with termites. You know, now that we want to rebuild a structure that actually works for us, that is innovative, is transformative, that includes everyone, isn't going to leave some of us out in the cold, that's going to keep everyone warm. And that's what I want to see. That's the kind of change I want to see.
We agree that this is a time that is rich and ripe for rebuilding, and rebuilding in a new way. And not in the old ways, that we can't go back to the way, though many of us would prefer, and there are a lot of people who would prefer or say they prefer, when it's just back to the way it was. But we realize it can't, and it won't. But that's not bad. That what can be so much better. And that's our hope. That's absolutely our prayer, that that's what we can do with this. We recently read an article about the Reverend James Lawson, who had worked with Martin Luther King to train young civil rights peacemakers to fight racism with love and respect. And Reverend Lawson is now 91 years of age, so he's able to look back on nearly a century of experience and experience, you know, and life. And he said that what's happening right now with Black Lives Matter, that so many people are calling it the wrong word. First of all, they're calling it a protest. And he said that's focusing on the wrong thing. That protest, he said, is such a bad term, because all these marches and walks are calling the United States to a new way of life. They're calling for the dismantling of the old forms of racist violence that we've taken for granted and replacing them with new forms of kinship that will allow us to be a far stronger nation and a better people. What are your thoughts on what he said?
Yeah, I think really the first time it was ever kind of formed to me, and inspired to me the message of, it's really important, if anytime you're showing up for any demonstration or calling to action, framing it from a place of what are we for is always stronger and always more transformative than focusing on what is broken. And it's not to say that we're not going to name what is broken and what needs to be fixed, because it's really important to know what's broken in order to build something new or to change it. But sometimes we get mired in what is broken to the point where we aren't able to see past it to envision something new, something better, something transcendent. And so for me, I often like to talk about in terms of what I'm for, what is the vision, what is the whole versus the none. And I think that is so much of what comes out of what these Black Lives Matter demonstrations have meant to me. When I saw the demonstrations in my neighborhood, just organically seeing the ones outside one day, sitting here, at my desk, and then hearing Black Lives Matter outside my window and looking at it and seeing mostly white neighbors in my neighborhood with signs saying Black Lives Matter, that was important to me. That was a what are we for moment. That was a wow, these are human beings who are in the middle of COVID-19 pandemic, standing up for justice, standing up for love. And for me, I think the last time I had actually had something rouse me to my feet, that I heard sort of a noise outside and was called to the window, was during Good Friday, when we would have the Catholic processions in my neighborhood march with the crosses, and they would chant and sing. And so it was almost kind of like a religious experience to see that, to say, oh, this is the last time that, something has brought me to my feet to want to be a part of it, to see it. And so it's really about, the communion, I think, that comes from being together to say we're all in this together. We're not going to rest until all of us are cared for, supported, and get what we need. And that's what I love about a good protest, right? That's when I think about, and that's why I was crying, because I, was not in a good health place to be able to be marching, was because I get so much energy from seeing so many people who are saying we wanted to do things differently, we can do things differently. There's a lot that we don't have, but what we have is each other. That's ostensibly the message. I mean, even if the march is 5 people, right? You got 4 other people who were in it with you. And some of the most powerful marches I have seen have been those sorts of smaller protests, or, just even some smaller sort of demonstrations I've been a part of, where, we would just go out and pray in front of a building. I've done that a couple of times, just meditating, big meditative and interfaith prayer sit-ins, which are silent, but palpable power, right? Of just we are all coming here together to give energy. The day before the Women's March, I did a spiritual event with a bunch of interfaith folks, and it was me, my friend Morley, who's this amazing singer and healer, Marianne Williamson, just Carrie Kelly, who does a lot of great work in the yoga space, and Lisa Bloom, who is a lawyer. It was just all these different people coming together, but to say, we're going to come to this church right now and have a spiritual event to bless the big, which we didn't know that day that was going to become the largest march in recorded history. We didn't know that that was going to happen the next day, but we're going to actually just have a bunch of people of faith, different religions, come together and just pray and talk about spirit and why spirit has brought us here, to say that we have a vision for this country and a vision for the world that is different than the current agenda that we're living in and that we're experiencing. And, a lot of people critiqued the Women's March at that time because they said, oh, there's too many things they're calling for, right? There's, what is this about? But that was the beauty of it. Like you said about, it's not just a protest. The beauty was they were saying, we see a tie, a thread that connects those of us who are marching for immigrant justice. We see a thread with those of us who are marching for climate change, those of us who are marching for gender, those of us who are marching for racial justice, those of us who are marching to stop children from being caged at the border. All of those things are connected because they're about humanity. They're about dignity. They're about the ties that bind us as humans, right? And so for me, that's what I like about the What Are We For? Because we have gotten away from this idea of understanding that it's actually quite simple, that we have all these different policies that we talk about that makes us think that things are about these single issues, but they're not. And, the Black feminist scholar, Audre Lorde, who, I see as a great literary foremother, who's taught me a great deal in her writing, said that we don't live single issue lives. So why are we pushing for single issue fixes for policy? It actually makes no sense. Even though our heads are taught that makes all the sense.
There's an awful lot that needs restructuring.
Yes.
We're sadly, our time's probably winding down here, but we do have just a couple more questions for you that I think would be really helpful for Michael and I and for our group of listeners. One is for those of us who are not persons of color or female, or who cannot truly understand or feel the institutional barriers of true equality. What would you like to say to us to help us be more aware, more sensitive, or inclusive?
Well, thank you for that question. I think asking that question is a really important one. So I think, for in terms of being courageous, I have appreciated the people in my life who have come to me to say, in our relationship, what are the things that you need? How can I be of support to you? But in a genuine way, not in a way that requires labor for me, but just in a way that, like, how can I show up for you in my power and my privilege in a deeper way? And what I've asked some of the white people in my family that are closest to me to do, like my husband and, my other really close beloveds, is to read my friend Layla Saad's book, Me and White Supremacy. It is a workbook, and it has a day-by-day guide of what to do. It can be done in community or it can be done by yourself, of things that you can do. And it has been really important and healing for me to see the journey that my husband and other people in our community have been on. And they're doing it together. And as a part of the work, they're not really supposed to be discussing with me like how they're feeling about all the things that are coming up. I see them like texting and things like that, so I know what's happening, but they're working it out together and working out their own experiences and the hard truths of what it feels like to have some of these things unearthed in a way that people who are living this experience just know, because we've had to. I was called the N-word the first time when I was 6 years old. It changed my life. But there are other people who haven't had to have that kind of awakening yet. And so now here's the opportunity to have that, to do that work. And I think that her book really lays out well how to do it in important, impactful, and healthy ways in a number of vantage points in your life. And then I also think that we underestimate the power of using our voices to advocate on behalf of those who might not have the privilege to speak up in spaces where we can. And I think that's important. And if you have a checkbook that would allow you to be able to donate to support other people doing the work who are directly impacted, to support the leadership of those who don't get the lion's share of funding. And so, one real tangible thing is to support organizations led by Black and brown women who get such a small fraction of the charitable funding in the nonprofit space specifically. Those are organizations who've, in most cases, been doing the work for the longest with the least amount of resources and institutional support. So one really tactical thing could be, if you have money or people who have it. And when I say money, I'm saying, if you have $25 to give, but you can organize other people with $25 to give to do it, do it. One of my friends asked, what could she do? What organization did I think she could help? And she runs a really amazing yoga studio and has a podcast and a platform. And I just said, whoa, fund Higher Heights for America. They are mobilizing Black women's political leadership. can't think of a better time to invest in an organization like Higher Heights. And every day is a good time to invest in them. But like right now, such an amazing opportunity to help support that work, right? And so she said, oh, that's great. And then I got an email just like a couple days later, $500 to Higher Heights, and have told other people about it, right? And I think that's just really important. And I can just say, as someone who runs a nonprofit, I've had a couple of people in the past few months send gifts to my nonprofit in honor of my leadership and in honor of the leadership of others in the organization. And that has been the balm to keep me going during this really difficult time, to say, whew, okay, you know, COVID-19 has other ideas about our sustainability, or we have these, you know, policy issues that we have to fight, and we have all these other structural barriers, but to know that people are investing in our leadership, that helps us go on another day. That helps me know my staff can see another day doing their important work. So those are two tangible things that I think are really important. And then like what you're doing, you know, having a podcast, speaking about the issues you care about, creating our own media. People complain about the media all the time. And I think it's really important to say, yes, we need to have media justice movements to reform our media and to make it more just for all. But we also do have the power to shape our own conversations too, and to flex our power. My husband and I just wrote an opera for Breonna Taylor together. He's a musician and wanted to give back. And he dropped a whole pandemic album with his home studio and donated the proceeds to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund on Juneteenth. So he was able to use his strengths to give back. And, you know, he did that as a white man in this country who, you know, knows more about, I think, sort of the experiences that I endure as a Black woman, just because he lives with me, but still is shielded from so much because of his power and privilege, but was able to say, okay, what is it that I can do within my power? Okay, I have music, I have art, I have a platform with my followers. I'll drop this album, and the community really rose to that occasion. So I'm just sharing all those examples to say too, that think about what it is you have in your community. If you belong to a church or a religious group and you can help set the agenda for their charitable giving, like have those conversations about what you can do. My church has been doing amazing things, and I just feel so supported there in this moment, because my church talks about how they value everyone. We talk about how we are supporting the most marginalized communities every day, and how that's a part of our ministry, right? So I just think we all have a role to play, and thinking about how best we can show up with our strengths and our resources is the best way to do it.
Your husband's pretty fortunate in this episode. You're really gonna have to share this with him. You're giving him a couple shout outs, which is fantastic.
Thank you. He's so good to me. You know, I mean, I think that's the thing. I feel like sometimes I'm like, oh, you don't have to post about this thing or that thing I'm doing. And I just feel like he is one of those people I get, like, just feel is such a blessing in my life. I think the only thing I would want to have changed is I wish we could have met each other sooner in our lives, right? Because he's just been such a blessing to me.
I just want to make one quick comment before I'll allow Michael to ask the last question here. We're really excited to ask this last one. But I think it's just coming full circle back to what we had mentioned earlier in the interview of being uncomfortable. And I think we just need to strive at times to be uncomfortable, to not always, maybe even this summer, I'm thinking of myself not reading so many novels, or maybe it means reading. I'm in the midst of just a really helpful resource right now called The Warmth of Other Suns. And it's been so meaningful for me to read. It's been stretching me in a lot of ways. And I know Michael just recently watched the movie Just Mercy, and I finished that book as well. And so I think it's just encouraging all of us to just maybe not be drawn so much to our comfort, but to our discomfort. So.
Yes. I mean, that is really it, right? That's where the growth lies. And it's so not comfortable. I'm going to remember this conversation in the next couple of weeks. I have some uncomfortable things that need to happen. And, you know, I'm going to remember, hey, walk your talk, Jamia, because your growth is not going to come from hiding from your light, from cowering down, one thing I've learned is sometimes people want to keep you where you are because they don't want you to outgrow who you've become to them. And, I often think of this Alice Walker quote about how no one is your friend who doesn't allow your growth, right? And so for me, I have struggled with that, there have been people who, I remember a former classmate was really upset because he said, when we were younger, you had this political belief and now you have this one, and I feel betrayed. And I remember just thinking like, that's not really my issue right now. I'm not going to hold on to that, because I can still care about that issue and put my focus on this issue because of who I am right now. And I don't need to kind of stay where you needed me to be to feel comfortable. So I'm going to take our own advice next time, because that's the thing that I'm really trying to live into, to kind of say, yeah, like humans, we really don't like to suffer. And we learn at an early age, you don't touch the hot things because you might burn your hand. And yet a lot of where we learn and grow and stretch in this life comes with sacrifice, and it comes with the real reckoning of who we are. And sometimes our failures and mistakes are the things that lead us to the light. So I'm really taking that in, and thank you for the opportunity to kind of have that conversation with myself right now as I'm
well, if you ever need someone to tell it to, we know of a valuable organization that will support you anytime.
I love that.
Absolutely. So one more question, and I hope this is the question you're talking about, Tom. By the time this podcast airs, we will have a woman who will be nominated for the vice presidency of the United States. It won't be the first time there's been a woman nominated in that position, or for the presidency, but there will be a woman who is nominated, and it depends what you read or what you hear. She may be a person of color, a Black woman in particular. What does that say to you as a Black woman, to have a person like you who is nominated for the second highest position in this land, and when we've never had a woman in that position, nor a woman of color, so close to the top?
Yeah, I mean, it's time, so I think I'm having a lot of feelings. I think it's funny because I thought a lot about when I called my now late grandmother. My other grandmother's still with us and is 98, but the other grandmother that I'm speaking of lived to be in her mid to late 90s. And I remember calling her when Barack Obama became president, and I was literally dancing in the streets. I was dancing in Union Square when we heard the news. I ran out, and I had a dress. I had participated in a fashion show that was themed around Barack Obama from this store called Goldwater that makes eco-sustainable clothes. And they made me Obama earrings. So I had Obama earrings on and an Obama dress. And I ran out in my Obama dress and Obama earrings, screaming into Union Square to this impromptu dance party that happened. And people were climbing onto the top of the subway. There was like an apparatus where, like, on top of subways, climbing up there, putting up flags and cheering and dancing. And it was total mayhem. And I remember calling my grandmother as I was a part of that, saying, "Grandma, oh my God, did you ever think almost 90 years ago that you would see this?" And I don't know what I expected, but I'm out there wearing Obama clothes and dancing and thinking, I never thought that I would see a Black president. And I was still so young. I think I was 28. And my grandma was like, yeah, I thought about how it's about time. It's about time. This should have happened forever ago. And so, yes, it's important, but baby, I'm going to go to bed now because it's about time. And grandma's tired. And I remember just thinking like, oh, I was hoping that we were going to have this monumental conversation and she was going to tell me how meaningful this was for her. But she was just like, because also, she came from this mixed family too. So I'm like, oh, and this is a multiracial Black president. Like, aren't you excited? And she said, yeah, baby, it's time. It's time. We needed to have that forever ago. And now we got time to catch up because we're so late. We're so late to have this happen. And so I think that she taught me a lot in that she was excited about Barack Obama and was proud to have casted her vote for him. But also it's just like, don't forget, baby, that this is high time, that we've fought a lot for this. and this needed to happen forever ago, and why did it take so long? And so this was like this very sobering moment, and like, and don't let it take that long again, was kind of the message I got from her. And so when I think about this opportunity, I think about how I want a world where, because there's so much conversation now about like, oh, what happens if this person would become the president, right? Because right now, Joe Biden is older than a lot of the candidates we've had as well, right? What if they were to become the president? And I, hope that he will be safe and healthy and all of that, but that's been coming up in terms of people's considerations as well, and saying, what would it mean that we would get our first Black woman president or woman of color president in that way, right? And I'm kind of like, what would it mean to have a world where we wouldn't have to think about having a workaround to be the way that we would get someone elected into that office as well? And either way would be monumental, right? But like the fact that we're having that conversation is just something I've thought a lot about. And then I was one of the 200 Black women who signed a letter to Vice President Joe Biden, and saying that we really, really, really want to see a Black woman or a woman of color in that role. And I said that as a person who personally was a Warren supporter during the election, but in this case, I really think it's important, specifically because of who carried him over the threshold and made it possible for him to be the nominee. And so I believe that Black women have been the backbone of what it's made it possible for the progressive candidates who have become our nominees for so many years. And I want to see that paid forward, that we're not just expected to be the foot soldiers, but also that we are given the respect and representation that we deserve for our leadership, that reciprocal nurturing that I was talking about before. So I'm excited to see what happens. I think the one last thing I want to say about it is that there had been some conversation where it was reported that James Clyburn had said, in some ways it would be more important to have a Black woman in the Supreme Court than it would be in the vice presidency. And Joe Biden himself in the past had said, that he would promise that he would appoint a Black woman to the Supreme Court, and people were focused more on that. And the thing that really got into my craw about that was, I want both. Mm-hmm. It's time for both. And that's when I hear my grandma being like, it's time. I want it all.
I kind of wonder if my grandma's response was more of like, there's still a long way to go here.
Exactly. There's a long way to go. And I'm going to be
a lot of restructuring that still needs to happen. And so let's get excited, but let's keep working at the same time.
Exactly. And with any of these women, right? I mean, that's the thing too. What I don't want to have happen, and also I'm going to be happy with whomever it is, because right now I'm just focused on, saving the Republic. But I think that what I want to see is a vote of confidence in the leadership of women of color. And, I think any of the women of color who have been named, and any of the women who've been named, like Elizabeth Warren, who I very much respect, are people whose leadership I think that the country really needs. But I also think that there's a specific perspective that we really need from the people who've been most affected by COVID-19 and those disparities as well right now, with women of color being the most economically impacted. That could really benefit from having someone who is closest to the issues in that position. So I'm, sitting on the edge of my seat, just like everyone else, and hoping that when this podcast is out, that we are celebrating history made. And most of all, it's also because I want the next generation to see that normalized. I remember one of my mentors has multiracial children who also self-identify as Black, grandchildren, who said that they didn't know that men could be president. Because they were so young and they saw Hillary running and had gone to all these Hillary events, that they didn't know men could be president, or white men could be president, because they had known about Barack Obama. They didn't know white men could be president. And I remember everyone was laughing when the kids said that. But it was an interesting thing because they had seen Barack Obama and then they saw Hillary Clinton running and did not know that white men could be president, and how asinine that sounded for all of us adults who'd like seen all the pictures growing up of who had been president of this country before Barack Obama. But I really got a kick out of that, because these kids were just like, yeah, I just didn't know that white men could do that. And that just being, such an interesting thing to think about in terms of the real reality of how the systems have been shaped thus far.
We just applaud you. We applaud the work you're doing. We're proud of the platform you're using to share your voice. We just hope people continue to listen to you because you have a lot to say.
Oh, thank you.
And there were just so many questions we didn't even ask because there's just so much to talk about. And you have so much to say. And we are very grateful. So, Jamia Wilson, thank you for
Thank
being
you.
with us today, for sharing, for your perspective, for the work that you're doing, for the voice that you share. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you both. And thank you for modeling beautiful allyship and for giving people someone to tell it to. It's so, so, so important. I mean, I think that's, just going to be something I'm going to think about too. Who can I be there to be a listening ear for even more? I think that's the thing that like hurts me the most, just the amount of people who I hear from, just readers of my books or things like that who feel that they don't have anyone to talk to. So I really thank you for the really beautiful work that you're doing. It's so important. It saves lives. So thank you.
Just real quick, if you want to learn more about Jamia's work, where could they do so?
Thank you so much. If you want to learn more about my work, check me out on jamiawilson.org or jamiawilson.com, both works. And you can find out about my work, different events that we can meet at, and also find out about my books and other organizations that I care about as well.
And we hope that we'll be able to meet you one day face to face.
Yes, I would love that. I know, right? We got to get this COVID thing handled so we can all gather again.
Right. We don't live that far apart. So, we long for the day that would be possible.
I can't wait. You live somewhere that's beautiful too. I've been where you are. So it's really beautiful.
Well, thanks again.
Yes.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, we truly hope you enjoyed that interview as much as we did. The fact is, one of the things we need to tell you is that when we finished and stopped recording this interview with Jamia, we continued to talk for another hour and a half. Totally unexpected. We had no idea that was going to happen. I don't think none of us planned that. And we thought she's a really busy person. She's going to need to go. And she actually said, no, I have time. Let's continue talking. And we just talked about so many things. We couldn't believe it, the way we connected with her. And we wish you could have heard all of that part of that recording too, because it was pretty extraordinary. Or that part of that conversation was pretty extraordinary.
I know I was surprised as well that the conversation kept going on and on and on. And I know at one point my wife poked her head in because we were packing for vacation as we were scheduled to leave the next morning, and so it was our packing time late on a Friday evening, but it was just so inspiring talking with her for that long and getting to know her more and hearing more about her values and the things that she really holds dear.
Yeah, and we realized, first of all, I want to ask you, did you get in trouble because you had taken so long to back? Was that not a good way to start vacation?
It's just most of our interviews end after about an hour and a half at most. And the fact that I was still locked in my room for an extra hour and a half.
Yeah, so it was a 3-hour total interview. So yeah, or conversation. So, but yeah, the values that we shared, about our faith, about how we look at people, about listening, about connecting, and the importance about leaning into hard stuff, and knowing that that's really how we grow and develop as human beings, and how vital that is. Yeah, it's really special.
I hope all of you who are listening, like us, just are willing to lean into uncomfortability to a degree, and to make ourselves uncomfortable, because we know that there's always more that we can learn, and there's more growing to be had. So we hope maybe that this conversation will encourage you and inspire you to maybe pick up a book that you've not read, that you've heard good things about, or to read another article, or to follow Jamia on social media. She's consistently posting articles that will challenge.
Yeah. Sometimes we kick and we scream because we don't like the uncomfortable stuff, but we know that ultimately we can learn. and we can become better people. And that's really what this is about, this podcast, the whole series. It's about that. So once again, we thank you for joining us today. We hope that you really learned something. And if you appreciate these podcasts, we urge you, we invite you to support them financially. You can go on patreon.com, and there are a number of opportunities for you to support these podcasts. You can support a single episode. You can do it monthly. Any amount of money will be helpful and important, and we hope that you'll consider that very much.
Yeah, so until we listen again,